Welcome to video 4. We're going to talk about inspecting the supercharger and its maintenance, replacing a knock sensor, and replacing a starter solenoid relay.
There it is, the infamous supercharger. As you can see, mine is two different colors, red and, well, let's just call it not red. I think that's just because all the paint peeled off the aluminum. Anyway, that's it. It's held on by 3 screws, E8 screws, and 2 of them you can see. There's one. That one can only really be taken off with like a closed end wrench or even an open end one. Well, no such thing for an E8, but closed end E8 wrench. On the second one, let's see if we can get down in there to find it. Well, it's back in here, down a little bit, kind of in there. And then the third one is all the way to the bottom underneath it. You'll have to use like a socket extension. You know, once again, it's an E8. But that you'll have to kind of get to it blindly. You can remove your intake hose, your outlet hose, and gain access to remove the supercharger. You can, grab here around the output area to get some leverage, and maybe work it loose once you're certain you got all 3 E8 bolts out. This one will take a very long time. You do like a quarter turn at a time, but you'll get there. Trust me. And when you do buy some tools, because it doesn't seem like anyone I know had E8s, buy a set, because when I had to replace the knock sensor, that one took a larger size E. I think it was an E10, but don't hold me to it. So just make sure you have a small set to work with. So here are the E-Torx hardware tools that I bought to work on the jet skis. Got some wrenches. Looks like I got 8 different sizes. Make sure E8's in there, and I would go up from E8. I haven't ran into anything smaller than E8 yet. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. This particular set starts at E6 and goes up to E20. And then I also got the socket set, which goes from E4 to E24. Both of them, like $20 each on Amazon, maybe 15, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. You're gonna need these to work on SeaDoos, so just get yourself something nice and you won't regret it.
I wish I had some more pictures to share with you of the parts inside the supercharger. I only got this one picture here. It's not very informative. That's just the sprocket and one of the bearings on the shaft. It could take a fair amount of effort to get the supercharger out of the engine block. One was easy, and the other one I had to pound on it and wail on it, and that's actually why it's in 2 different colors. I had to go to a salvage yard and it turned out just to be the dealership. They had some jet skis out in the back 40, and they had a supercharger. They gladly sold me the top half of the cast housing too, and the paint was nice, whereas the one in there, the paint had already peeled off, so that's why it's in 2 colors. You might have the same kind of difficulty, or you might get lucky. Don't try to put a big pipe wrench, big channel locks on the intake of the supercharger, because that's what I did, and that's what broke. That the aluminum there is just too thin for a seized up supercharger. So here in this exploded view is all the parts of the supercharger from my SeaDoo. I put some little red checks next to the parts I want to talk about. Those first 2 are the bearings. Some of the blog posts and things talk about these bearings needing to hit 45,000 RPM, which is interesting. Most bearings of this particular size don't actually even hit that range, so it's a little bit eye-opening if those things really are spinning that fast. The only bearing I could find that would come close to having that RPM capability for an open cage bearing, oil flooded, was the FAG bearings. And funny enough, those are the ones that were on the picture in my 2 superchargers, so I guess that's good. But I bet you those ones all over the internet being sold in kits are not. Maybe I'm wrong, but just FYI. The next 2 checks are the suspect washers that everybody talks about. When they first introduced these jet skis, those were ceramic washers. And So if something was to heat up and get, temperamental, those ceramic washers, I guess, would bust into little pieces. And what you may not understand is everything to the right of that supercharger housing is basically inside the engine. So if that bearing starts to go and seizes up and throws its balls, they're going to end up in the engine. Those ceramic washers that break up, those pieces, they're going to end up in the engine. You think anything in the engine that doesn't belong there is going to come out all right? It's not. You're going to be in a world of hurt rebuilding an engine is what you're going to be. So that's why the supercharger maintenance is of paramount importance. They say every 100 hours. I would stand behind that, especially if you have those ceramic washers in there. Also, I would always keep your ear out for squealing bearings as a telltale sign that they're about to go. I mean, you start hearing high-pitched squeals that aren't normally there, it's probably one of these bearings about to, shoot its balls everywhere. So that's my 2 cents. There's lots of good videos on YouTube on how to rebuild a supercharger. I'm not going there in this video, but I did want to give you my 2 cents of what I thought about it. When you're looking at these washers, it's really hard to tell if they've been replaced unless they're of a different color. The first ones, I guess, were like a gray, dull gray, blackish kind of color. I guess one upgrade to steel turned them golden color. However, if your previous owner, like mine, chose to get a rebuild kit from Riva, you wouldn't know it. You'd think, oh crap, these still have this original ceramic washers. But I started to look real close, and on the side of my washers, you could read Riva, and I was like, oh yes, they've been replaced. Moving on to the next problem I found. One of the first times I actually had the ski out running halfway decent on the water, I got an engine alarm, came up, gave me a code, and then so I turned around and went back to the boat ramp to put it up and continue working on them. I went to the dealership when I had the keys programmed on the machine, and the service tech showed me the engine code that displayed, and you can see it here in this picture. And basically it said, that the knock sensor was out of range. Here's a little bit better picture of the engine code being thrown on the Bud software P0326. And whether you're in the shop manual or online looking at what the engine codes mean and where they tell you to go look to repair it, either way works fine. You can find it out on the internet, or you can have a copy of the shop manual. Mine was leading to the knock sensor, and so when I looked it up, I found out what I needed to go through to fix it. It led me to believe that the knock sensor was out of range in the sense that the signal it was getting from the knock sensor didn't make sense, which makes you believe that the knock sensor might be malfunctioning. So here is a picture of the knock sensor itself, and when you read the shop manual, it says that the sink should be reading out 5 mega ohms. So if you have any experience with the little voltmeter, stick the 2 leads on the end. The pigtail end actually connects to another connector just on top of the throttle body. I think it's the bottom of the 3. You can unplug it, stick your voltmeter in there, and look for 5 mega ohms. Mine just wasn't reading damn near anything resistance wise, so I knew something was up, and I knew that was what I was targeting. One thing to be careful of, I read in the manual that some of the skis have a resistance changing cable harness right after the knock sensor. That must have been a change somewhere along the way where they needed to adjust the resistance going into the ECM. So make sure you're looking at the right one, because that's one of the troubleshooting procedures. If your knock sensor is giving you 5 mega ohms, then you've got to check the resistance of this resistance changing cable assembly and make sure it's got the right resistance change through it, or the right resistance through it, and then you can keep tracing it all the way back to the ECM to see where things are going awry. In my case, I got lucky. It didn't have the resistance change harness, and it was the knock sensor itself. It was the first troubleshooting step. So how do you get to the knock sensor to replace it if it's defective? Well, you got to move the intake manifold out of the way. And in this picture, this actually shows you the 7 bolts holding the manifold to the engine block. You remove those 7 bolts. The reason they're numbered in the order they are, that's the number, that's the order you tighten them back down. You torque them down to, you torque number 1 first, number 2 second, so on and so forth. So you take those 7 E8 bolts out. You probably, if I remember right, also need to take off the intake throttle body hose. And when you get all 7 bolts out, it'll push forward, and you can look between the engine and the intake and see the knock sensor bolted to the engine with, like I said, I think it's an E10. It might be slightly different size, but it was another E-Torx wrench. And you can reach your hand down in there, get it loose, put a new sensor in, voila, problem solved.
So if you're going to start up your machine and it just doesn't start, or every now and then it starts but sometimes it doesn't, you're hitting it with your thumb, and maybe you have to hit it 5 or 6 times and it'll finally try, do it halfway, and then eventually start up. Most likely what your problem is your starter, relay, and solenoid, and that's underneath these guys. So you just pull this off, and you see where these 2 big red wires are coming in. That's what I'm talking about. That is the part that's got to be replaced.
The difficulty I had with the starter solenoid relay was one of the 2 posts that those big red cables were attached to was loose. It was actually just, the whole post was spinning inside the solenoid relay, the relay slash solenoid, whatever you want to call it. To me, it's a contactor. Basically, the 2 wires going in at the bottom activate the middle plunger, which pushes up and connects both posts together, letting the power through. So anyway, getting off topic. So I had to basically get a pair of pliers, big channel locks, call over my neighbor, say, hey, you mind holding this while I run through one of these posts with my reciprocating saw? And you can see that was the end result. That's how I was able to get the second wire off, put them all back on a new starter solenoid relay that I bought off Amazon for, I think, 12 bucks. Works like a charm every time I hit the start button now, just like it's supposed to.